Job replied to the Lord, "I know that you can do anything, and no plan of yours can be thwarted. You asked, 'Who is this who conceals my counsel with ignorance?' Surely I spoke about the things I did not understand, things too wondrous for me to know. You said, 'Listen now, and I will speak. When I question you, you will inform me. I had heard reports about you, but now my eyes have seen you. Therefore, I reject my words, and am sorry for them. I am dust and ashes."
Well, good morning. I'm Phil, one of the pastors here at Christ Fellowship Eastside. Glad to have you with us. Happy May the 4th for those of you who observe that holiday. Excited to wrap up our series on Job this morning. And we're here at the very final chapter of the book, and I'm going to provide some summary even of the previous 5 chapters and kind of give us a lay of the land and try to land the plane with this book of Job, this really incredible and unique book in the whole Bible. And I hope it's been helpful and meaningful to you as you've engaged with the text of Scripture and worked our way through this series on Job. And this morning we're going to look at the courtroom drama of heaven and earth. And the way I would just kind of set this up for us to think about is that getting the right guilty verdict matters. It really matters to make sure that the finger gets pointed, the blame gets placed on the right person. We've seen people take to the streets over this issue. We've seen things that have become common pop culture references. Things like, if the glove doesn't fit, you must acquit, was one from my childhood. And a lot of this is pervaded into courtroom dramas, a whole genre of movies and TV. I think of one that came out when I was young, probably too young to be able to see it. It was A Few Good Men that featured Tom Cruise. And he functions as a JAG officer in the Marines. And he's there to have to defend 2 Marines that were guilty of taking a punishment too far on another Marine, ending in that Marine's death. And so he has to defend them. He usually just kind of plea bargains and kind of cuts the deal, doesn't really care about getting to justice. He just wants a quick resolution. And in this process where he's having to now throw down and get really engaged in cross-examination and pushing into the facts and getting into the details, he discovers that it's not those 2 Marines that should be up and declared guilty. It should be Jack Nicholson's character, the colonel that should bear the blame. And so the whole court case begins to turn and begin to shift. And can he land the guilt on who it belongs to? And we're faced with these kinds of questions in TV dramas and in movies because these kinds of stories are stories of intrigue. They pull us in to say, is the guilt going to get placed on the right person, or are we going to get it wrong? It really matters. And so we're faced with that question of who is guilty in these key situations. And here we find ourselves in this book of Job, and we're seeing this gross, awful thing happen to Job, this thing that we could probably even describe it and say, well, this seems really evil that this thing would happen to Job. And we're left with this question, well, who's at fault here? Who messed up? Who did wrong? And that's really the question that pervades the entire book of Job, where we're left asking, like, who did wrong? Who messed up? There has to be something that went wrong here. And in fact, what we've had throughout the book of Job to you is effectively a dual courtroom drama. We have a courtroom of heaven that's introduced to us in the very first couple chapters. And we're exposed to something behind the curtain that you and I don't get to see, is that there's a whole dynamic of what's happening in heaven. There's a whole spiritual warfare element of this whole story that's playing out that Job has no clue exists. And so we're exposed to that briefly for 2 chapters, and then it goes silent. It goes quiet. And so we're left to wonder, how does this get resolved? And even at the end of the book, it's shrouded in secrecy as to what the final verdict is. We have implications, and I'm going to point us to what those implications are, but we're not told the grand resolution of what happens in heaven. But there's also a courtroom of earth. And the courtroom of earth really plays out throughout, starting in chapter 3, all the way down for nearly 30 chapters of back and forth, of dialogue, of cross-examination, of different witnesses coming to the stand, And that's what makes the book of Job really so difficult, is you have all this back and forth and all this dialogue, and you just kind of can get stuck in it. It's pretty muddy, and you can just never move forward. But the ultimate question is, with the courtroom of earth, is not the question that consumes the courtroom of heaven. See, the courtroom of heaven is consumed around the question of, is Job guilty of using God, or does Job serve God with pure motives? The courtroom of earth is consumed with a different dynamic. The courtroom of earth is consumed with the question of, is God a just judge, or is God an unjust judge? And that's the ultimate thing that lies underneath all of the debate, all of the challenge in the book of Job. The heart of the book is what's going to happen with these two courtrooms. So I'm going to walk us through kind of how this plays out through the book of Job. We'll get a running start all the way up to our passage and hopefully paint a broader picture of this kind of courtroom drama that's beginning to play out or has played out through the book of Job. If you remember all the way back to chapter 1, we said there was an issue that started here with the suffering that came into Job's life. And initially, Job takes this position where it says in verse 22, he did not sin or blame God for anything. We said that that's courtroom language. He did not enter a charge against God for what had happened to his life. Even though really terrible things had happened to him, he says, I'm not going to enter a charge against God. I'm not going to take him to court over this. Whew. All right, everything's going great. But then in chapter 2, something happens. His wife comes to him and says, no, you need to press charges. She says, effectively, she says, curse God and die. She says, put the blame where it belongs. Job, I know you. I've known you for far too long. You're very careful. You always sacrifice. You're always trying to care for your kids and care for your family. You don't deserve this. This kind of evil doesn't belong in your life. The guilt in this situation belongs with God. And so effectively, she's saying that we need to take the blame in this situation and put it with God. Press charges against God. You don't deserve this. But then, throughout the next nearly 30 chapters of the book, Job has been pressured by his friends, hey, just plead guilty. Surely you have done something to bring this on your own self. In chapter 4, verse 8, one of the great examples of this is Eliphaz comes to him and says, in my experience, those who plow injustice and those who sow trouble reap the same. He's saying, just accept your guilt. Admit that it's not God that's at fault, but it's actually you, Job. You're at fault for this situation. You've brought this on yourself. And so he places all that on Job and says, you're just reaping what you sowed. Surely somewhere in your youth or childhood, you've done something terribly, terribly bad. And so whatever you're reaping right now is the result of that. But Job doesn't take this sitting down, does he? So for all these chapters, he starts going back and forth with his friends. He wants to defend his innocence. And so we get stuff like chapter 9, verse 32 to 33. He says, for he, God, is not a man like me, that I can answer him, that we can take each other to court. There's no mediator between us to lay his hand on both of us. He's saying, I don't have a Tom Cruise to come fight my case here and get me off the hook. I don't have that mediator at the moment. Chapter 10, verses 2 and 3, he says, I'll say to God, do not declare me guilty. Let me know why you prosecute me. Why are you coming at me? Is it good for you to oppress, to reject the work of your hands and favor the plans of the wicked? He's basically saying, God, do you not realize your verdict, whatever you have done, the decision you have made to bring suffering into my life, it was the wrong decision. You made the wrong call here. He's putting the guilt and the blame over on God. Effectively, he's in the box and saying, you know what? Maybe it kind of belongs over here. He doesn't maybe go all the way out to say it directly, but the implication is there, isn't it? God, you messed up. God, you're kind of at fault here, maybe, kind of. Chapter 13, verses 3 and 18, he says, "Yet I prefer to speak to the Almighty and argue my case before God. Now then, I have prepared my case. I know that I'm right." You say, I'm just absolutely confident that if I could just get into the courtroom of heaven and argue my case, get my plea before a just judge, that I could win. And he's so confident. He's ready to name names. He's ready to come in swinging like Mace Windu in Palpatine's chambers. He is ready to go. He goes on, chapter 16, verse 18. He starts to build some confidence that even beyond what he sees, he says, even now, my witness is in heaven. My advocate is in the heights. He's saying there's got to be, in order for me to win this thing, I've got to be able to call some witnesses. And there's got to be someone who's going to witness on my behalf from heaven. And there's got to be someone who's that lawyer in heaven who's going to defend my case. Because this is really, really, really wrong. And there's got to be someone else who will take this up and make sure that justice is done on my behalf. And then in chapter 23, verses 3 to 5, he says, "If only I knew how to find him, so that I could go to his throne. I would plead my case before him and fill my mouth with arguments. I would learn how he would answer me and understand what he would say to me." You can almost feel the sadness in Job at this point, chapter 23, where he had a lot of high hopes about what he could do to convince God that somehow God had gotten something wrong here and that he's actually not guilty. And that God has somehow kind of messed up, or maybe God just missed something in the grand scheme of things. But in chapter 23, you almost see the defeat of I can't even get to that courtroom. I can't even make it into that place where I can defend myself. I can defend myself to my friends, but I can't defend myself in front of God. I don't even have that opportunity presented to me. So as we start to move toward the end of the book, we get this interesting character, Elihu, who just kind of shows up out of nowhere. I had a really good conversation with Ross about this one, and it was one of those things where it's like, I need to study that and kind of land the plane on what I think about this guy. Basically, you've had these three friends who've been cycling through these debates with him throughout the book, and then all of a sudden this fourth dude just shows up, and he's saying some things that basically contradict some of the friends, and he says some things that contradict Job, and it's like, what do we do with this? And I think the best I can make of it is it seems like this is almost kind of a prophetic word that kind of prepares us for God to show up. Because this man is not condemned along with the other three friends. He just inserts himself into the story as a prophet would in the Old Testament. And so we get this man named Elihu who prepares us then for Job's day in court. He's been longing for this. And this is what I want you to get when we kind of wrap up this book, is that all throughout the book, this is what he's been wanting. This is what he said, if I can finally get in front of God, I'll plead my case, I'll win him over, I'll show him that something got messed up on this side of the equation, that everything's okay on this side of the equation, if I could just get to God and prove it. And so now, God's there. God shows up. And when God shows up, I mean, just look at this. In chapter 38, you see God's entering into the courtroom. How does God enter in? It says, "Then the Lord answered Job from the whirlwind. He said, 'Who is this that obscures my counsel with ignorant words? Get ready to answer me like a man. When I question you, you will inform me. Where were you when I established the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who fixed its dimensions? Certainly you know. Who stretched out a measuring line across it? Who supports its foundations? Or who laid its cornerstone? While the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. Who enclosed the sea behind doors when it burst from the womb? When I made clouds its garment and total darkness its blanket? When I determined its boundaries and put bars and doors in place? When I declared, you may come this far, no further, you proud waves, stop here. God shows up in the courtroom, and it's amazing. First thing to notice here, it's a very personal entry into the courtroom. It says, for the first time in the book, it's referred to God as Adonai, as Lord in the abstract, or God in the abstract. This is the first time in the book of Job, the entire book of Job, that the personal name of God shows up. Most of your Bible translations will render that in all caps, Lord. That's God using his personal name. The book of Job says, the personal God shows up to court. You know his name, Yahweh. He shows up, and it says, and then the Lord answered Job. The Hebrews use a very particular word here to indicate dialogue, back and forth. When Job talks about how God speaks to Satan or to the angels, it uses a very directive kind of speech, a talking down to sort of speech. But when God speaks to Job out of this whirlwind, God uses conversational answers. Implication, Job, I've been listening to you the whole time. I've heard the arguments. You didn't know, but I was listening. And I'm here now to answer. The conversation now starts. But don't mistake who this one is who shows up. He says he shows up in the whirlwind. I think it's just this beautiful translation that captures this idea of a mighty storm. People in the ancient Near East were very familiar with storms that would come off the Mediterranean, storms that would sweep down over the mountains. Jesus encountered some of these storms out on the Sea of Galilee. There were dust storms that occurred in the desert. People knew the force of tornadoes. They knew the force of incredible winds. And here God shows up, and when God shows up, he shows up in the whirlwind. What do you think that brings Job back to? Probably brings him all the way back to where it started. What was it that took the lives of his kids? It was the mighty wind that came in from the desert. Here God shows up clothed in that, wearing the very thing that brought destruction into his life to begin with, the thing that turned his whole world upside down in a moment. But interestingly, when God first speaks to him, he uses this phrase. He says, answer me like a man. Literally, gird up your loins like a man. This is how, in the ancient Near East, this is how dads would talk to their grown boys. Son, I want you to come with me. Come with me out into the field. Come with me to the marketplace. Gird up your loins. They would gather up their garments so they could hustle. Let's go. It's a phrase of respect. I'm speaking to you like a man. I'm not treating you like a child here. I'm going to talk to you like a man to man. And I'm going to communicate what's going on. It's a very amazing moment where you have all these things that should be at odds with each other, all coming together, juxtaposed into one, when God enters the courtroom with Job. And so then God begins his opening argument. We've heard Job's argument. We've heard his counter-argument. We've heard the cross-examination. We've heard it all for 30 chapters. And now God gives his opening argument. And what is God's opening argument when he takes the witness stand? What's the greatest character statement you've ever seen? God tells us what we ought to think about himself. He says, it's important to know what's not there. First, God does not clarify why this happened. He doesn't say, well, you see, there was this thing that happened. You know, there was Satan, and we were having this argument. No. You don't get the satisfaction that you get from watching a Hallmark crime drama where at the end of it all, the person says, well, this is how I did it, and this is why I did it, and you're satisfied with this person who's totally undercut their case in court, so that you can have the satisfaction of knowing exactly why and how this whole murder took place. That doesn't happen. God doesn't come in and clarify the details. There's also no consolation. He doesn't come to him and say, Job, I'm really sorry about this. I really did mess up, and I need to own that, and I feel really bad about this whole situation. God doesn't do that either. There surely would be some element where Job would say, I deserve an explanation for what happened. I should feel better. But instead, what you get is confrontation. God shows up and says, do you understand who I am? Do you understand the one you have placed on the witness stand? I don't think you do, Job. I don't think you really understand who I am and why I'm here. Let's get down to brass tacks about who I really am, that you've been wanting to confront me. And it leaves Job with this incredible tension. And we feel this today when we wrestle with issues of theodicy, a good God and evil in the world. How do we resolve that tension? I love how certain YouTubers or others will put that out there like, aha, I found the thing. It's like, no, Christians, Jews have been wrestling with that question for centuries. Okay, this goes all the way back to the book of Job and before. We know that challenge exists. That's not new information. The challenge is the resolution that's provided to us in the book of Job implicitly. See, Job, when he is confronted with who God is, he's left with two challenges. One, he could try to deny the God who is there. But now the facts are in his face. That God exists. So the path of the atheist is closed to him functionally. He can't just deny that God exists. He's seen God speaking to him from the whirlwind. And so now the only option that exists for him is to say that God doesn't know what he's doing. That God messed up. And the whole point of chapter 38, 39, and into 40 is that this is not the kind of God that messes things up. He said, Job, I operate on an entirely different level than you do. I operate with full awareness of everything that has happened in the past, everything that will happen in the future. I operate as one who laid the foundations of the earth. Do you understand this? Do you understand the person you put on the witness stand? And so he realized, if I'm going to be angry at a God that great and a God that big, is it perhaps possible that a God that great and a God that big enough to bring that kind of suffering into my life and to do that kind of creative activity, is it possible, just possible, that a God that great might have purposes in that suffering that I can't possibly fathom? Is it possible that one who created the universe and everything that exists operates with an understanding of laws that transcend time and space, things that I don't even have access to with my finite human wisdom? And in fact, this is, you may think, well, that's an interesting idea. This is, in fact, the reason why most philosophers who are atheistic and would argue against Christianity have retracted the argument against theodicy. They have retracted the argument that says, how could there be a good God and great evil in the world? Simply because of what Job says here. It is simply that in our finite wisdom, we look at those things, and if you're going to say, I'm positing the God of the Bible cannot possibly reconcile the evil in the world and his greatness, then we have to posit that the greatest being that has the greatest wisdom, infinite capacity for understanding, infinite knowledge, couldn't possibly have a reason for the evil that exists in the world. It has to posit that I have as much wisdom as that God has in order for that argument to work. But if the Christian God exists, then we're left with this challenge of if he's a big enough God for me to be angry at for the situations that have come into my life, then he's big enough to have sorted out why that suffering has come into my life. He's big enough to understand why that pain needs to be there. And so Job has been preparing for this day in court the whole time to make that argument against God. And he gets there, and he's realizing all of his argument now falls flat. There will come a day where all of your frustrations with God, all of your anger and resentment against him, will all fall flat in the courtroom of his justice. And we see that as Job enters into the cross-examination for God. Chapter 40 tees this up for us. The Lord has answered Job, and then verse 3, Job answered the Lord, I am so insignificant. How can I answer you? I place my hand over my mouth. I've spoken once. I will not reply twice, but now I can add nothing. So I had this all planned out. I had all these logical arguments for why this should be the case, why God is at fault here. And I can't even answer. I'm left with this recognition that I have nothing to say about this situation, and surely the guilt belongs over here. I have no case to argue. And so God offers his closing argument. In chapters 40 to 41, the argument turns a little bit. My explanation of those first couple chapters is that God presents himself as this one whose wisdom should be unquestioned. Whereas what happens in these next two chapters is a little bit of a shift. He begins to emphasize his power. And he talks about these two beasts, Leviathan and Behemoth, that excite all teenage boys who finally get this far in the story, where it's like, wow, what are these creatures, these amazing beasts and stuff. This is incredible stuff that enters into the equation. What's happening in these chapters is God invites Job to say, I want you to think about the most fearsome beasts that roam the planet. I want you to think of the things that haunt you, the things that exist in nightmares for you, the things that you dread. I want you to think about that. Can you do anything about those? No, you can't. Who can do something about those? I can. I made those things. I'm more powerful than all of that. Job, the situation that you think is completely impossible, the thing that has gone way out of control, that has brought devastation and destruction into your life, that you can't fix, I can. And for us, the readers who know the drama, the courtroom of heaven, saying all the beasts of hell itself, even though those forces may be aligned against us, one little word will fell them. It is Jesus Christ himself. It is God incarnate. God has power over all of those beasts. And so there's this argument. He's pulling Job to this point where he's saying, just trust me. Just trust me with your pain. Trust me with your suffering. All this time, Job has been thinking, I'm ready for the trials. But he's not. God is the one that would prepare him. God is the one that could alone make Job's situation right. And so where does it end? Chapter 42, where we wrap up. Job's final words here in the book show us several things. Number one, there's a point of exhaustion he's come to. If you look at verse 2, he said, I know that you can do anything. No plan of yours can be thwarted. You're in control of all of this. You asked, who is this who conceals my counsel with ignorance? Surely I spoke about things I did not understand, things too wondrous for me to know. You said, listen now, and I will speak. When I question you, you will inform me. You can just see the exhaustion of Job, where he's been preparing for the argument, all the back and forth. I don't know about you if you have. I know when I've had reviews and stuff in the workplace, or I've had kind of annual performance kind of evaluations and those kinds of things, I will often, for the week prior, I'm running through, what is my boss going to say, and how do I need to respond? And he's going to come at me with this, and I probably need to counter with this, and here's what actually happened in this situation. I'm gaming this out, and I've got all the scenarios in my head. Job has all of that running through his head, all the wheels spinning. And then when the moment finally hits, he's got nothing. Because God is the one that's in charge. And so he says, I have nothing. I'm just exhausted. I've worn myself out trying to prepare for this. But then verse 5 is amazing. He says, I had heard reports about you, but now my eyes have seen you. You can hear, you go from that move of exhaustion, of I've worn myself out trying to argue against you. Oh, but now I've seen you. Now I've come before you. I actually got to experience the thing that I had always hoped for, I'd always dreamed of. Job realizes all his sorrows, his complaints have melted away, not by having all the answers. He's in a place where all the things that were once fuzzy have now become clear for him. And it's not because his trial was explained, it's because his God appeared. And when God shows up, Job says, that's enough. That's enough for me. If I can just see God, if I can just experience his presence, his closeness, if I can know that, then it's worth it. Yeah, his God was the one clothed in the whirlwind, clothed in the tornado, clothed in the hurricane. But out of that storm comes the voice of a friend. And for Job, it was worth it. And so then verse 6, he says, therefore I reject my words and am sorry for them. I am dust and ashes. What you get is, literally the Hebrew reads, I despise, I repent. What does he despise? Your translations render it different ways. The ESV says, I despise myself. CSB says, I despise my words. The translators are trying to figure out, what on earth does he despise? I like the rendering of the NASB here, where it just leaves that open-ended. He says, the NASB renders this, it says, I retract. That's it. I retract. I love that. It's just this open-ended. It's the Homer Simpson disappearing into the bushes kind of moment there. It's this. I'm done. I now cease and desist. It reminds me of the time I went. I showed up in court for a speeding ticket, and I sat down with the police officer. And he's going through, how do you plead? How do you plead? And guilty. Got to me. I said, not guilty. Okay, come over here. The rest of you, go pay your fines. All right, And so I sit down and explain the situation to him, explain what was going on, and explain my side of it. He says, hand me your ticket. I hand him my ticket. And across the top of it, he writes, nolo contendere. No contest. I retract. Yes. I just say, be careful driving through Welford on 29. Just word to the wise. Not always will you get the retraction. But there is that sense where Job finally just says, I'm done going about trying to do all the self-justification. I'm done trying to convince everyone that I'm not guilty. I'm done. I give it up. I retract. The case that I finally pressed forward, I now remove from court. And so with the court case removed, now there comes time for a final verdict. The final verdict, I would argue, is kind of implicit. It's not directly stated on the surface. What happens when Job removes his case from court? I would say there are three people that he needs to be cleared in front of. He needs to be acquitted before God. Does he still have a good standing before God, even though he pulled his court case out trying to defend himself? Well, here in verses 7 through 8, we get 4 times, if you can just circle it in your Bibles, where it says, verse 7, you have not spoken truth about me as my servant Job has. Now take 7 bulls and 7 rams and go to my servant Job and offer a burnt offering for yourselves. Then my servant Job will pray for you. I will surely accept his prayer and not deal with you as your folly deserves. for you have not spoken the truth about me as my servant Job has. Why is it so important that he uses this language of servant 4 times? If you remember all the way back in chapter 1, what did God say about Job? He says, have you seen my servant Job? Implication, where he started is where he ended up. He didn't lose it. He didn't lose his position before God. Job remained faithful. Yeah, it was a tough journey. There were ebbs and flows of faith throughout the book, but God didn't find that lack of faith disturbing at particular points. Even when things cleared up, and even when things were not clear, you see all throughout the book, Job's focus was Godward. How do I get to God? Consumes him through the entire journey. And in that, his heart was in the right direction. And so at the very end, God says, you are faithful. Well done, my good and faithful servant. Satan loses. God wins. Job is faithful. This is Job's acquittal before the court of God. Not guilty. Job is also acquitted before his friends. He spent all these chapters arguing with these guys, trying to explain why he's in the right. And God creates a situation where he says, guys, I need you to go clear things up with Job. I need you to go apologize to him. He's going to pray for you. And Job is able to help his friends be made right with God as his friends are made right with him. Isn't it fascinating? All of Job's efforts at self-defense throughout this entire book, all of his efforts at self-justification in front of his friends are worthless and are all resolved in the matter of just 4 verses here, where God says, I got this. Guys, apologize to Job. and all of it goes away. You almost got to be like, why did I waste my breath? So that's part of the point. And then lastly, he's acquitted before everyone. In verses 10 through 17, we see how God gives him back all kinds of stuff. Now, I would challenge us. I think I have been prone to misread this. I've been prone to read this in the wrong way. I often have read the last verses of this book as, oh, isn't that nice? Job gets all his stuff back. Oh, but he lost his kids, Yeah, he gets more kids, and that's great, but he still lost his kids. He doesn't really get all his stuff. Then what does this do at the end of the story? I would argue, I don't believe that the end of the story is about Job just getting stuff back. It's about getting his honor back. Because everybody has been looking at him and pointing fingers at him and saying, that's a guy who's getting what he deserved. He's reaping what he sowed. But here at the end, he gets it all back so that the watching world goes, wow, God must have his favor on this guy. It's more about clearing Job's name in front of the community than it is about Job just getting his stuff back. Because Job has experienced something far greater than the stuff of this life can ever give you. So, we have a conundrum. How is it that Job can get the free pass? He can get off scot-free in this situation. Somehow, Job goes without blame. Job is acquitted. And somehow, God gets off the hook as well in the book of Job. God is not guilty. And we're meant to wrestle with that challenge. In fact, God brings it up himself. Chapter 40, verse 8, he said, would you really challenge my justice? Would you declare me guilty to justify yourself? Saying, Job, you have been functionally taking the guilt and trying to put it on me this entire time. That's what you've been trying to do through all of your arguments. The guilt has to go there isn't the option to say, well, we'll just take the guilt and we'll, do we pin it on Satan? Do we pin it on the friends? Do we pin it on his wife? Where does the guilt go? And that's kind of where we're stuck at this point in the book. is where does the blame get to go? And that's where I would encourage us to look to Romans chapter 3. Romans 3 addresses this challenge of where does the blame go? Because Romans 3 gets to this question of you and me. And we may look at Job and say, here's a like really righteous guy. Like he loves God, he loves his kids, he's invested in his family, really good dude. He handles suffering in ways that I don't know that I would be able to do. What an amazing guy. That's not you and me, is it, if we're honest with ourselves? And so we have this problem of this guilt that we carry. And Romans 3 brings us out to say, well, how can we get rid of the guilt that hangs on to our lives without it going over to God? Without there being some kind of judicial malpractice that happens in the middle. And so Romans chapter 3 says in verse 24, Christ Jesus, whom God put forward as a propitiation, meaning an atoning substitute, one who takes the place of another, by his blood to be received by faith. We apply what Jesus did to us by believing, by faith, to show his righteousness at the present time, so that he, God, might be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. Do you see the argument there of Romans 3? He's saying we have to be able to get rid of the guilt somehow. And we can't get rid of the guilt by giving it to God. And God doesn't want to give it to us. He wants to be able to clear us. So how do we resolve that? He's saying at some point, when we place our faith in Jesus, Jesus is our substitute, the one who takes the penalty for our guilt, who takes all of the wrath of God poured out on him. It takes someone in the middle to be able to take the guilt and dispose of it. Gone. And that's what happens to our guilt. The conundrum of Job's guilt is resolved in the work of Jesus Christ. Your guilt can be erased. Your shame can be undone. All of the disgrace that hangs on to you can be rid because Jesus Christ is your substitute, your atoning sacrifice, the one who took the penalty you and I deserve so that our guilt could be erased. Jesus goes down in judgment, the judgment we deserve, so we can stand before God justified, just as if I'd never sinned. No guilt, no wrong, no sin, no shame. This is the conundrum of Job resolved. How does that change your life? Three quick things and we go. Number one, it ought to give you immense stillness in times of suffering. Job wastes a lot of breath trying to defend himself for 30 chapters. We don't have to do that. When suffering comes in, when shame clouds us, you don't have to run and hide. You don't have to pretend it away. You don't have to try to put on a better face for others. You don't have to step out of small group. Lean in. You don't have to defend yourself because one has already defended you. Number two, you can be a person marked by incredible forgiveness. You look at Job. I mean, he's really had it with these guys. At the very end, what does he do? He prays on his friend's behalf. He's able to seek forgiveness. People who've been transformed through suffering are able to bring transformational forgiveness to other people. And then lastly, there is a mark of fullness that comes into the life of Job. I don't know what suffering you have in your life, what you bring into the room. For some of us, it's physical. Some of it's spiritual. Some of it's emotional. Some of it's family. Some of it's other people. You may never get answers to why that exists. You may never get results in this life that roll it back for you. You may never get restoration for financial pains or loss. You might not get that. But what if you get God? By that, what if you ended up through your pain, through your loss, with a deeper intimacy with God than ever before. Is that calculus worth it to you? The fullness that Job experiences is something that is available to all of us, even when the most valuable things that we hold dear in this life are stripped away, to then receive a relationship with the eternal God, the God who is there in our suffering, the God who is there in our pain, not just in the abstract, but incarnate. The God stretched out on the cross, God with scars. That one knows our pain.